Welcome to a new episode of Crypto Law. I'm Anne-Sophie Kloet, and our guest today is Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School. So welcome, Kevin, and thank you so much for making time to talk to us. I'm sure you have so many things so many insights to share with us today on DeFi and everything related to it. So welcome.
It's my pleasure to be here. Absolutely.
And first, one of the first things, just to delve into it, is talk about the key risks and the key opportunities as well that DeFi can offer. And of course, I know you've been very active listing those opportunities and potential challenges in the DeFi Policymaker Toolkit that you collaborated on with the World Economic Forum. And there are a few more that you picked up on in this article for the conversation that you wrote. And I would like to talk to you about those in particular today. Perhaps the first one, financial inclusion. So we know DeFi enthusiasts often say DeFi can bring financial inclusion. DeFi critics would say, well, it's just all about speculation. And you wrote that DeFi eliminates the distinction between ordinary customers and the wealthy individuals or institutions who have access to more and many more financial products. So that's in between. So it's not saying it's only about speculation. It's not saying it's necessarily financial inclusion the way we traditionally understand it, but it's somewhere in the middle that shows that DeFi can be about more than speculation. So it doesn't matter right now when we talk about the legal rules for DeFi. It doesn't matter what these use cases are. And if it matters, do you think there are use cases beyond speculation that are existing right now or that you see evolve in the near future?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And of course it matters. If in practice, this is a system that lets millions of people around the world get the benefits of banking and the financial system that couldn't otherwise, and also gives them access to more sophisticated kinds of financial products, either that they couldn't get access to or that are much more costly for them to get access to. Things like credit, for example, that can be used for all sorts of things. If that's what DeFi is doing or is going to do to a large extent, that's a social good. And policymakers are going to think about that social good. On the other hand, if that's a theoretical possibility, but not one that's actually happening for any number of reasons. Really, DeFi is about taking the kind of existing casino of global high finance and making it exponentially faster and larger and more complex. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not that regulators go looking around trying to stop people from speculating. But first of all, regulators get worried because the same speculative asset that may be fine if I am an institutional investor or participant in a large hedge fund with a significant amount of capital, that would not be good if any retail investor could just put their life savings in that without appreciating how to manage risk. That's one piece. And then the other piece is, these speculative activities also open the door to scams and fraud and systemic risk and all these other things policymakers are concerned about. So as you say, I tend to be of the view that these things are not mutually exclusive. It's not that either DeFi is all about financial inclusion or it's all about speculation. If it's really just about speculation, then that's a very different story from the ones that the DeFi community is telling about why this is a beneficial development.
Okay. And I think what you just mentioned also shows there are challenges that perhaps we need to understand as this industry just keeps, exploding or has been booming for a lot for the last few months. One thing you mentioned in your article in the conversation was the difficulty of transposing existing rules to DeFi. And you wrote that it's not even clear how we can apply the existing rules to DeFi without traditional intermediaries. And I think that theme has been coming up regularly, most recently in the discussions about who is a broker in the US infrastructure bill. We've seen it with the Financial Action Task Force struggling with how to impose any money laundering rules in a decentralized network. We've heard just recently how Angela Walsh was saying in the US Senate Banking Committee hearing about how we should really consider whether miners or developers are intermediaries. And it seems to point all in the same direction, that there are really two options. Either we find intermediaries, and if we don't find traditional intermediaries, we find anybody else in DeFi that we could use as a legal hook to impose rules on. Or we just accept that DeFi works differently, perhaps doesn't have the same level of intermediation, and therefore we cannot apply the same rules in the same way to DeFi as we do to traditional financial markets. What's your view on that? Where do you think the discussion should be heading to?
Based on what I've said before, it may not surprise you that I'm going to say there's actually more of a middle ground, and there are more options than it seems. So yeah, absolutely. One option is to say these are decentralized systems. And if there is a set of smart contracts that are running on the decentralized Ethereum network that constitute the Uniswap exchange, and those smart contracts, without the intervention of anyone, will allow me to, stake 2 tokens and have transactions, be made across those tokens on a liquidity pool. That there's nothing to regulate, because you can't just tell a smart contract do this. It's just a bunch of code that's running on a blockchain. That's one position, and the other position is, no. If there's securities trading going on, if basically what is happening there is something that violates the securities laws or other laws, then there needs to be a search for how to enforce those laws. It turns out that there's potentially a spectrum of options, and we're just starting to explore what they are. So what was interesting about the US infrastructure bill debate, this was about in some ways a fairly narrow issue. This was about, and it was not explicitly about DeFi. It was about tax compliance for people who trade crypto on centralized exchanges, where there's no debate. If I buy Bitcoin low and sell it high on an exchange, that's a taxable event. At least in the United States, it's clear that I owe taxes on that gain, as with other kinds of assets. And it's also somewhat clear, although not fully clear, which is one reason for this proposal, that the exchange I'm using has some obligations to report to the government my transactions. But then you start asking, well, what does that mean if I'm buying low and selling high on Uniswap or a DeFi exchange? And it's the same exact scenario. Then we have to go to the question of, okay, can the intermediary be regulated? If not, what about other kinds of intermediaries? And that got to this question about miners and wallet providers and so forth. But as I said, there's a lot of other possibilities there. One possibility, for example, I'm not advocating this, would be to say no regulated financial institution or service provider in the world can interact with these DeFi systems because they're not regulable as such. And so if you want to just play in a completely hermetically sealed world of digital assets, knock yourself out. But anything that touches the traditional system is off limits. I mean, we had a little bit about this with banks not custodying crypto assets. Now, the initial reaction might be, well, so what? Why do we care in DeFi? Well, DeFi is based on stablecoins. And the dominant stablecoins are all based on traditional fiat assets that are backing them. And even MakerDAO, which is the largest one that is a purely, at some level, purely decentralized stablecoin, you go and look, and depending on how you count, either 30% or 60% of the collateral in MakerDAO already is USDC, which is a centralized stablecoin, which again is backed by fiat currency in a bank with a centrally regulated custodian. So for example, that's another. I'm not saying that's the right answer, but one could regulate DeFi without regulating DeFi, and I suspect there's a lot of other levers to pull. And so, really, what needs to happen now is policymakers in the DeFi community need to start examining what those are and the pros and cons for different scenarios. And as opposed to just saying, well, don't regulate, saying, if your concern is money laundering, here is an approach that satisfies your concern, but that doesn't do damage in other ways. And those are the debates. Again, we're just starting to walk up to them. I think that's what we're going to be fighting about the next few years.
And there may be even, of course, nothing prevents the Uniswap developers from making a tool that any user can use to see what price they buy at what price they sell that can help them with tax compliance. I mean, nothing prevents the industry from coming up with certain tools to help compliance. And what you say, it also shows that perhaps instead of having these abstract discussions, perhaps we should look at specific specific examples. And once we look at specific examples, it becomes much more clear the options that we have.
Totally. And for example, with Uniswap's a decentralized exchange, it's an automated market maker, but there is an organization that's involved in development of it. That organization, which runs the Uniswap website and owns the domain name, even though the code itself is open source, and the smart contracts operate on the blockchain, that organization said, we are no longer going to process through our front end transactions involving stock tokens. If you create a synthetic stock equity as a token, you can't trade that on Uniswap because under US securities laws, that's not legal. Interestingly, Germany and some other jurisdictions are starting to create regulatory regimes for that. But in the US, it's clearly not authorized. Uniswap, undoubtedly because they had a visit from the regulators, is saying, okay, now we are blocking that. However, you can still, if you're sophisticated enough, go and access the Uniswap smart contract and trade those same tokens, despite that. So that gets into a more concrete, and then we have a question. As a practical matter, should that be a concern for regulators? Because the vast majority of the volume comes in through the Uniswap website, domain name, developers, and so forth. You're absolutely right. We need to go down a level from these abstract views to concretely what's going to happen.
And these discussions take place not just among regulators or lawmakers or academics, but obviously the Uniswap community itself has had some, quite a bit of discussion about that rather controversial moment where indeed you saw that intervention on the front end. Something else you mentioned in your article for the conversation, and I think you touched on it earlier when you mentioned systemic risk, is we know DeFi is built of these Lego blocks, these money Legos. We know that has advantages. We know that may create certain risks if one of those Lego blocks turns out to be faulty, has a bug. And you mentioned in the conversation that DeFi makes it easier than ever to create these hidden interconnections that could lead to problems. Do you think that DeFi has some of the issues that we saw in the run-up to the financial crisis? Are there things we should be aware of in DeFi to prevent this interconnected risk?
Oh, absolutely. No, and the analogy is, the financial crisis started with home mortgages and credit default swaps, which were not what anyone thought were really central assets in the global financial system. And then, all of a sudden, problems in those seemingly obscure markets caused credit in the entire global financial system to freeze up. And it turns out that part of that was interconnected risk and hidden leverage, really, and especially hidden leverage. And so that's why a lot of the regulatory response to the crisis was deleveraging and stress tests and higher collateral requirements and so forth. So DeFi is an environment where today none of those regulations apply. And so if you are creating some DeFi service, or you're using some DeFi service, there's no sort of Basel III or financial stability board to tell you what your capital reserve requirements are. That is prudentially what economists would say is safe. And so one issue is just sort of none of that infrastructure exists. At least it's not mandated. I mean, if you're a sophisticated DeFi player, you may be doing some of that risk modeling. You probably should be yourself if you have a lot at stake, but it may be imperfect. And then the next piece is, just the what DeFi does is it lowers these barriers. Anyone can put money in, anyone can provide liquidity or collateral. And then anyone can programmatically access these smart contracts and plug pieces together. And so that's just sort of the kind of problem. I'm not making any predictions, but the class of problem that the financial crisis represented, where there was this toxic interconnection of these different kinds of financial instruments, it seems like that is going to be much easier to have that happen in DeFi. Because it's just so easy to say, well, what if I plug this derivatives engine with this trading engine, with this and the other, and I don't have real-time visibility into all those pieces. And something happens in one piece of the system, it can, the shock can be magnified out. So that's absolutely a concern. And there's some of the smart folks in DeFi, and for example, some of the people that we had in the group that helped develop the World Economic Forum report are thinking about exactly those questions, like how do we do risk management in this environment? But again, it's still a nascent area.
Even though, of course, we could say at least we have the on-chain data and at least we can monitor certain things. That doesn't mean
absolutely.
Everybody not everybody is technically capable of accessing those data, interpreting those data, bringing structure into those data to see what matters. Totally. So the transparency is there, but of course it doesn't mean because it's on-chain that necessarily we know how to interpret everything that is on-chain and what to do with that.
Absolutely. No, and the transparency is important. And that's, one reason why DeFi may not wind up like what we saw with the global financial crisis is you don't necessarily have the same opacity of some of these bunches of assets. So that's absolutely right. But again, that's a practical question. You look at what happened in the financial crisis. One reason the ratings agencies often got it so wrong was not just that they were financially incentivized. It was that they were they could see all of the assets in these mortgage pools, but you had to actually go on the ground and look at what were all the mortgages and what was actually happening, and they themselves did not appreciate what the risks were, even the ones who saw all the assets. And so that, transparency is a great thing. It's important. It's valuable for, in DeFi, but it's not a miracle solution.
True. And the transparency matters in many ways. It matters also for the on-chain governance, where you see DeFi and the decentralized governance models that we've seen. Some have criticized it for hidden types of concentration. But in the end, we can still see much more about how things are governed, who proposes what, who votes for what, than we can in the traditional sector. I was wondering what you think of, you've probably looked at some examples of decentralized governance. What do you think are the benefits? Is that something that it's just DeFi, or will decentralized governance and this transparency in DeFi perhaps incentivize the traditional financial world to change as well?
Yeah, decentralized governance is a fascinating area, and it does expand beyond DeFi. It didn't start with DeFi. It started with DAOs for other kinds of activities, and so we've seen it take off because so many DeFi projects have implemented token governance systems. But I think it's going to be important well beyond there. Well, so one first set of questions, which as with these other things, is a factual matter that we need to understand better, is to what extent is DeFi governance really about decentralizing governance versus being about things like, for example, creating exactly the same thing as a token, which would be classified as a security, which people invest in for prospects of appreciation of the token, but which escapes from the securities classification because nominally it only gives governance powers and not control rights. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but that's one thing that might be happening, which would be problematic and where the governance is not really the point. Another thing that might be happening is that decentralized governance is deliberately a way to avoid legal responsibility. Going back to our conversation earlier, that it's not about the benefits; it's just about finding a way to not be responsible. That would be problematic. I think there's some of that happening, but I think there is clearly genuine interest in decentralizing governance. Well, so one piece, as you said, is it's transparent. One piece is that it's liquid and it allows actors who would not otherwise have access to participate meaningfully in governance to do so. You can have a vote with and be involved with one token. And also you might be someone who is very knowledgeable and very involved. And the fact that if you have a lot of tokens, you're strongly financially incentivized to want the project to succeed. You may exercise a valuable role in governance that is not captured by traditional governance structures, which is to say you've got a board of directors and managers and all of that. They may not be the ones who are most aligned with the long-term interests of the enterprise. So all of that makes sense. And it's also just this great opportunity for experimentation with these different token models and quadratic voting and all sorts of other things. in ways that are really interesting. So again, I believe fully that experimentation is not entirely cynical, that a lot of it is trying to find ways to create things that are more open and more fair and that can be governed more effectively. But that's also not the whole story. And so, and even the part that is the story, it doesn't mean it's going to work. There are reasons why traditional governance systems exist. And it's not just because we didn't have blockchain. There is value in centralization. And there's efficiencies in centralization. Even when ideally it would be decentralized. I mean, this goes back to Ronald Coase won a Nobel Prize in economics for asking, why do we have firms? Why isn't everything just a set of market transactions? And there's a bunch of really good answers to that in transaction cost economics, which again, that all doesn't go away because of blockchain. It's a factual question about what changes and what doesn't.
Yeah, and at least for me as an academic, I find it really interesting at least to see what the community is discussing and if these things you mentioned, if they come up at all, or if we really just talk about one specific governance proposal for one specific protocol, or whether we're actually talking about these bigger picture questions that we also should be addressing.
Oh, absolutely. And expanding the scope of participation is a really exciting and valuable thing on lots of levels, partly in terms of what it means for governance of the project, and partly because you have lots of smart people from different parts of the world and people who aren't traditionally participating in governance decisions that are able to do that and then go off and do other things. So all that I think is good, and it's a manifestation of the transparency you talked about, that we have all of these tools now and specialized tools being built for DeFi governance and decentralized governance in ways that are valuable. Those are, I think, good spillover effects that are happening because of this.
When in 2018 you published your book on the blockchain new architecture of trust, obviously DeFi wasn't what it is right now. If you would write an update of that book, if you write a new version, is there anything new about DeFi? Is there anything about trust in DeFi that is different from blockchains in general or crypto assets? I know it's a very, very big question that we could discuss for hours, but is there anything specific that you think something that we should be aware of trust in DeFi versus trust in blockchains or crypto as such?
Yeah, what I tried to do in writing the book was to write something that was going to be durable about a phenomenon which was fast changing to the point where it was a certainty that my book would be well out of date by the time it was published. It was 11 months between the time I gave the publisher the absolute final approved draft and that anyone could buy that hardcover book that was published. Wow. And that's an eternity in crypto,
it
right?
Is.
And that's from 2018 when it was published, let alone now. So that's a given. So the question is, what changes and what doesn't change? And one thing that doesn't change is trust. Trust is a fundamental phenomenon in society. It's really important to understanding how business works, how social relations work, and all sorts of other things. And many smart people have written about and thought about trust for literally thousands of years. And so the difference between 2018 and 2021 in crypto is insignificant compared to that. So the basic point that I make that blockchain is important as a new, what I call architecture of trust. It's not the elimination of trust, but it is a new decentralized form of trust that allows for new kinds of trust minimized systems. That remains the core innovation. And DeFi doesn't change that. DeFi is another example about how that manifests itself. I think that's still true. It's also still true that we need to examine what that form of trust is. And that for these blockchain-based systems to be successful, they need to be trusted. And part of being trusted includes consistency, broadly speaking, with the legal, regulatory, and governance system. And that doesn't mean that all the traditional rules need to apply to all of these systems. Of course not. But it means that an endpoint that says that we have this activity and it is completely outside of legal accountability, I don't think that will be successful for these services, because nothing like that has ever been successful, because then ultimately you can have plenty of people who are altruistic and well-meaning. There will be bad actors and the bad actors will win. Again, this has happened every time in history, and there's nothing that Satoshi wrote down that changed human nature. And these will not be trusted systems. I mean, there are plenty of examples of if I want to move money in ways that are not surveilled, I can do that. But those are not going to be maybe I'll get caught, but even if I don't, those entities I'm dealing with are not going to be as successful as the ones that are regulated. So that all that hasn't changed. So DeFi is a manifestation. It's a much more worked out example of the potential of this technology. I was writing in 2018 or writing in 2017 when we'd seen the first flowering of token offerings and sort of the manifestation of this smart contract model that Ethereum really popularized. But it was still a question of what's this really useful for? Is this really just about these ICOs that are trying to scam people out of their money on tokens, or are there functions that actually have traction that people want to use? So to me, DeFi is the first real killer app that there is real activity going on DeFi as DeFi. So that would be a part of the story that I didn't know to tell back then. But again, it's an example. The fundamentals haven't changed.
And perhaps on a parting note, the same questions arise for DeFi when we think about, oh, well, DeFi is only this or is only that. When we look at where we came from, the time of ICOs to where we are now, we could have the same development from DeFi where it is now to, say, DeFi or something else in a couple of years. So perhaps on the last very quick question is, where does the D in DeFi lead us to? What can decentralization lead to? You already mentioned that DAOs, for example, were there before DeFi, and that's something that has potential by itself. Where do you think the decentralization could lead us to?
Yeah, so it's true that all the parts were there before, but you could say the same thing about Bitcoin. And in fact, Satoshi footnotes all of the examples where everything in Bitcoin was there before, but it wasn't Bitcoin. It wasn't put together, and therefore didn't have the impact. So the fact that there is now on the order of $60 billion locked in DeFi smart contracts, and it's working. So we had the DAO in 2016 on Ethereum, but it blew up in a matter of weeks. Now, even though there is lots of hacks and fraud and failures and so forth in DeFi, we have a basically functional system in many ways. So the decentralized piece.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
No, that's okay. I'll just restart that sentence. You can just the hope is that you do have that radical decrease in costs from the removal of intermediation. And the hope is that there is a radical increase in transparency. And the hope is that there is the possibility for communities to flexibly organize in ways they couldn't before. That's what a DAO allows for, is you have a particular community that wants to agree to a set of rules. It doesn't matter that the rest of the world doesn't want to do things that way or isn't interested in the same things that they're interested in. They can credibly bind themselves to those rules. That's a really powerful thing. Again, that is an innovation in economics and human behavior and society. The concept has been described, but we didn't have the particular technical means of realizing it. So all that's exciting. And then of course, you magnify it at the scale of finance. I think I put this statistic in that article that finance is a $20 trillion a year global industry. And so if a fraction of that is operated in this new model, that could be transformative in all kinds of ways we can't predict. So that's absolutely true. And again, we're experimenting and learning what the best practices are. We need to do it in a way that recognizes what the dangers are. That's always what I want to point out. But recognizing the benefits doesn't mean ignoring the dangers. Recognizing the dangers, though, shouldn't mean ignoring all the benefits and the possibilities. Indeed,
and I think that's a great message to stop and to end here, to say, well, experimentation, something very exciting, and to be aware and keep this open perspective, the different things it could lead into, and it has both benefits and challenges and not one or the other. Thank you so much, Kevin, for making time to speak to us. Thank you for sharing all these insights. Learned a lot. Good luck with the rest of your research. It's great to see what you're doing. It's great to see what Wharton is doing, what you're doing personally. And so very much look forward to any updates you have on DeFi, crypto, blockchain. Always interested to read your insights.
Glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again. Thank you, Kevin.